Which, thank you, Dr. Suzanne. I'm going to do this prayer, short prayer. I'm going to say it in this language, introduce myself again. My name is Clayton Shirt, but everybody calls me Clay. I am a traditional knowledge keeper at Wapabenez, as Suzanne has said already, but I'll say it again. My spirit name is Runnin' Wolf. I'm of the Wolf clan. I belong to many societies. I belong to the Meday Society and other societies, but I just want to say miigwech and Happy New Year to everyone, and welcome to everyone for coming to this virtual space. Traditionally, we'd be in person, but we cannot do that. So it's been a challenge for a lot of us to do these openings. So I'm going to do my best to invite spirit in, and that's the whole purpose of an opening, is to invite spirit in. We just imagine and picture ourselves all in a circle together as human beings, right? We'd all come together, and that elder and that knowledge holder would be given that tobacco, and that person would invite spirit in and sort of partition and ask for the ancestors and give thanks and to allow to come into this virtual space and wherever you are. And so I'm going to try and do my best. And I'll just say, I always like to say miigwech. I always like to say thank you. I always like to acknowledge our first mother of all mothers. There is no mother beyond this mother, our mother, the earth. I say miigwech to her. I say thank you to her. I pray to her. I pray for her in gratitude for everything she provides for us, the people, and our four-legged friends, the crawlers, the swimmers, the flyers, our relatives. We acknowledge them. But I also say miigwech to her for everything she does for us, the people, for the medicine she provides for us, the food that she provides for us to sustain this beautiful gift called our lives. I give thanks to our mother, the earth. I love you. I say miigwech to you. So with one mind, one heart, I say thank you. I offer my prayers to Father Sky. Again, I humble myself. Again, I partition, I ask the spirits of my ancestors, those beautiful ancestors, your ancestors, wherever you are, to be with you in a kind way, in a good way, in a humble way, in a loving way, to guide us in these very difficult, challenging times as people, as human beings. And I again partition to give us strength in these difficult times to our ancestors. I love you. I say miigwech to you. So with one mind, one heart, I say miigwech. Again, I face that, I acknowledge those four sacred directions, but I acknowledge that Eastern direction where our grandfather sun gives the appearance of rising in that Eastern doorway for bringing the light, for bringing a new day, a new beginning for all of us, for bringing the warmth, for making the medicine grow, for bringing light. I say thank you to Grandfather Sun for this new day, this new beginning for all of us, the people and our relatives. I say miigwech to you, Grandfather Sun. I look back in the past. I do not live there, but I look back in the past. And if I have done any wrongs, I have this day, I have this moment to make it right. And I am so grateful to you, Grandfather Sun, for this moment, for this day. I say miigwech to you from my heart. I say miigwech to you, grandmother of all grandmothers, Grandma Moon. You are so beautiful in the night. Again, I humble myself. Again, I pray to you. I pray for you in gratitude for everything you do for us. All the special gifts you do for us, everything you do for us, Grandma Moon. But I acknowledge this, we acknowledge this, we come together as the people in this virtual space. It is challenging. I say miigwech to you, Grandma Moon, as I sleep, as my granddaughter sleeps, as our children sleep, you do this for us, the people and our relatives. You put the waters, the rivers, the lakes, the oceans, into order for us as we sleep, as we rest, as we heal. I say miigwech to you for this, for giving this, for doing this for us. For water is life. I acknowledge this. We acknowledge this. I thank you from my heart. I pray to you again in gratitude, Grandma Moon. I pray to you. I humble myself. I say miigwech to you for everything you do for us. You are so beautiful, bringing light in the night. I say thank you. Milkamis, Grandma, I love you. I say all my relations. So with one mind, one heart, I say miigwech to you. I say thank you. I ask to you again, Creator, great mystery, for there is nothing. I stand here, I humble myself again, for there is nothing beyond you, Creator. I say miigwech to you for this beautiful gift you have given us called life. I ask for the blessings for all of us who come together and our family members who are not here and our children, our loved ones, to help us, to guide us, clear our minds, open our hearts in these very difficult, challenging times as we face as human beings. I say miigwech to you, Creator, for this gift called our lives. I ask that for blessings for this virus, may it never enter your homes, my home, may it go around our homes, may it go under our homes, may it never touch our hands, may it never give us strength in these difficult times. I say miigwech to you, Creator, for this beautiful gift called life, all my relations. Miigwech, 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 all my relations. And thank you for allowing me to say this simple prayer today. And I say miigwech to you all my relations. Miigwech.
Miigwech, thank you, Clay. And now we'll turn it over to the wonderful Dr. Sabina Mirza, whom I've had the pleasure of getting to know and working with over the second part of 2021. And I'm really excited for her presentation. And I know that everyone's going to really love this. So please take it away, Dr. Sabina.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just screen share. Thank you, Clay, for that beautiful opening and for starting our webinar with so much gratitude. I'm just going to close this here. Hopefully everyone can see that okay. I also want to thank Roy for organizing everything for us today. And I just want to thank Dr. Suzanne Stewart for providing me with this opportunity to present my research today. My name is Sabina Mirza. As Dr. Suzanne Stewart already let everybody know, I am a recent graduate from York University with a PhD in education and specifically in youth homelessness in relation to education. And now I'm working as a postdoctoral fellow at the Wakabinnis Institute for Indigenous Health at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at U of T. I'm really excited to be here today because sometimes I find after you've spent so much time in a PhD program with a particular project, what happens is you end up kind of moving on to different things and not revisiting that work. And so I'm excited to be here and share that work with you today. The other thing that I'm really excited about is that I'm sharing a piece of the work that I haven't shared in this much detail before, which is the aspects of mental health as a theme in this work. So what I did was I went out to explore the educational experiences of young people who are homeless across York Region, and I found out so much more than just that. I learned so much about their life stories and their childhood experiences and just their interactions with different systems like the child welfare system and the shelter system in Canada. So I'm here to share that with you today, and I'm going to be speaking specifically about that mental health piece. There might be some hiccups along the way. There might be some times where I'm reflecting and just thinking about things along the way. So bear with me. I will try to be as engaging as possible. I know it's always really weird when there's these webinars and I can't see everybody's beautiful faces, but I will try my best. And if you have any questions or comments, you can put them in the chat and I'll try to attend to them at that later portion. Okay, so as there's always so much knowledge and learning to share, I've tried to put together this agenda just in order for me to stay on track and in order for me to stay on time. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to first provide the context for this work. As much of this work was done in York Region, a lot of the data collection was done in York Region, where I currently live, and at York University, where I spent almost 2 decades pursuing post-secondary education. After this, I'm going to speak about my positionality as a researcher. I think it's always really important to do that, especially when you're doing qualitative research and ethnography and when you've spent time in the field with people. I'll then speak specifically about my doctoral research and some highlights of the research. Then I'm hoping that out of this presentation, you will learn something and there will be some takeaways. So I will share some of my takeaways from this research, and hopefully those will be some of your takeaways as well from you tuning in. And then I'd like to discuss some of my goals and next steps. And lastly, we can end with any questions or comments that you might have. Before I move any further, I think it's really important to address the context of this work, and I want to talk a little bit about that first. So you'll note from the current slide that I visited 4 shelters across York Region over the course of 1 year. So you'll see these like black squares that say Sutton Youth Shelter, Blue Door Shelter, Belinda's Place, and 360 Kids. So there was Sutton Youth Shelter, which is part of Salvation Army, and it's religiously focused, which presented some barriers for youth. There was Blue Door Shelter, which is a male-only shelter. There's 360 Kids, which in my opinion was probably the most progressive of the 4, and still presented barriers. And then there's Belinda's Place, which is a women's shelter where young women were also staying. So I was able to interview some of the young women staying there. What I did was I interviewed 40 young people who were homeless or experiencing homelessness at that time in York Region. And from the 40 young people that I interviewed, 11 of these young people identified as Indigenous. Now, I think it's really important and it's concerning to note that in all these 4 shelters that are in York Region, first of all, they were all really spread out and it took really long to get there. So that would be one issue. The other thing I noticed is that I didn't experience any Indigenous knowledges or Indigenous ways of knowing that were embedded into the practices of these shelters. And if they were, and I'm mistaken, they weren't, this knowledge wasn't made apparent. In saying this, I also think it would be remiss not to begin with acknowledging the land and the experience of Indigenous youth whose homeland comprises the territory that became Canada. As many of us are settlers on this land, I think it's our collective responsibility to pay respect and recognize that this land is the traditional territory of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nations. And we are here because this land was occupied. In recognizing that this space occupies colonized First Nations territories and out of respect for the rights of Indigenous people, it's our collective responsibility to recognize our colonial history and present day implications and to honor, protect, and sustain this land. More specifically, with regards to this map of York Region, where so much of this research was completed, this is land that is originally and exclusively cared for and stewarded by the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. The Anishinaabe people who currently reside in York Region are descendants of a larger group known as the Chippewas of Lake Huron and Lake Simcoe. So as we all know, colonization has ruined everything. And centuries of colonialist activity resulted in cultural oppression, assimilationist policies, characterized by forced removal from families, systemic physical and sexual assault, and spiritual, psychological, and emotional abuse, malnutrition, inhumane living conditions, death, and murder. I know this is very tough to talk about, but the importance of acknowledging this history is rooted in the fact that the gravity of these racist and oppressive historical events continues to impact Indigenous youth today. So please keep in mind, as I go through my presentation today, that when we think about youth who are homeless and Indigenous, and who may also have strained relationships with parents, difficulties in school, and mental health challenges, we have to recognize that these youth have been shaped by this really oppressive and unjust history. What I learned through during this research is that Indigenous youth are overrepresented in the youth homelessness population. I mean, if you think about it, I interviewed 40, and out of the 40, there was 11 who are Indigenous. This is a very high number. And while sometimes we might think that their pathways into homelessness are, or school disengagement or mental health challenges seem similar to youth who are homeless, even other racialized youth who are homeless, we have to understand that they aren't the same. They are far more complex. If we consider some of the quotes that are shown on the current slide, we begin to get a sense of how young Indigenous people had shared with me about the child welfare system and intergenerational trauma that they faced, and how these really oppressive systems have shaped their circumstances and almost thrust them into poverty and homelessness. And sort of what happens to young people when they're forced to interact with such systems, whether it be the child welfare system or the shelter system. Doing this work was really not easy. Homelessness is never a happy story. So just a cautionary note, as I'm sure you can already tell, that with some of the quotes and things that I'm going to share, this webinar is it's not going to really be a happy one. So anytime we speak of housing and homelessness in relation to young people, The stories are really sad and they're extremely difficult to bear witness to. And so, yes, of course, there's some stories of courage and resilience, but the truth is that, the biggest thing I learned is that we have all these societal assumptions of, if people would just get a job, they wouldn't be homeless, or people are choosing to be homeless. But the truth is, if we think about it, nobody would choose to be homeless, panhandling, couch surfing, living in an encampment, especially not in the harsh weather that we have here in the winter, unless they were extremely desperate and had nowhere else to go. The situation of homelessness, as we all know, has become even more worse during the ongoing pandemic. And so this topic is even more sensitive and pressing at this time when people are grieving various losses. And this portrait of homelessness is changing because more people are experiencing this dire situation as they're losing jobs, as the cost of housing and rent is just skyrocketing in Toronto. My methodology for this research consisted of an ethnography. Just a little refresher on what that means. Traditional ethnography is when you go and live amidst the group of people or the culture that you'd like to know more about. I didn't conduct a traditional ethnography because when you're doing research with human participants, especially in a place like a shelter, there are ethical limitations, especially when it comes to confidentiality and privacy. And so this wasn't possible. So what I did was, over the course of that year that I did my data collection, I spent as many hours as possible. And in some fields, like the field of education where I'm from, that is considered, a modern day ethnography. Then what I did was I asked young people to fill out surveys, and I took part in a 1-hour interview with them to better understand their situation of homelessness. And, I didn't begin this research in hopes to interview certain population groups. So I didn't think like I'm going to go out of my way to interview only youth who are Indigenous and homeless, or only youth who are Black and homeless. But what happened is, along the way, I started to learn more about pathways and the different demographics of people who are homeless. The surveys actually taught me a lot about demographics. For example, I would have never known that 11 of the 40 young people were Indigenous because nobody comes to an interview and says, "Hey, I'm Indigenous." So in that way, I think the surveys were good, even though I wasn't going to do them at first, because they helped me better understand those demographics. I also learned that homeless youth face so much stigma that when they are given a survey, there's so much survey fatigue. Like, a lot of researchers come into shelters like I did, and they don't always have the right intentions, and it's more about personal gain. And so what happened was, when I gave out these surveys, a lot of the young people said, like, you don't have something that matches what I want to put down. So what I had to do in that moment was I had to relinquish control, and I had to say, this is a collaborative process. And I had to allow participants to sort of write down whatever they wanted. And this was a way for me to decolonize my methods instantaneously on the spot while I was doing research. What I did was I analyzed the interviews through thematic and narrative analysis. And from the major themes that arose, you can see on the current slide, a lot of the young people told me about their family life. They told me about the shelter system, and then they told me about their health and mental health, and about education and schooling. And so those two last points are what I'm going to talk to you about most. Just a little tidbit of information. On the left-hand side, you'll see a picture. This is sort of this alleyway or laneway where, at one of the shelters, the young people and I would just hang out. We would have a cigarette together and spend time together. These are obviously pre-pandemic days that we were doing this. And so just a little information there about that picture. I think it's always important to locate yourself in the research, especially when you're doing qualitative research and when you're doing community work. Before, during, and after, and even still completing this work, I had to ask myself, who am I to do this work? What's my positionality? What are my privileges? What are my beliefs, my biases? And how does all of this impact my interactions, my interpretations, and my analysis of the narratives that young people told me? I also thought about reconciliation and what that means, and how supporting Indigenous people to reclaim what is rightfully theirs, what was stolen from them, how that's everybody's responsibility. And so I want to be able to contribute to that and share that burden, so that it's not just one group of people who are putting in the effort to do so. At the same time, like I said before, no matter how genuine our intentions are, doing research means that there's always going to be knowledge gain on the part of those of us who are academics. And so it's necessary for me to admit that there's all these multiple and intersecting positionalities that I occupy. I'm anti-oppressive, anti-sexist, anti-racist, anti-homophobic, anti-classist. Those values are inherent to me in my work. They're threaded through every aspect of my work and all my interactions that I had with youth. Paradoxically, despite how genuine our attempts are, researchers can never be completely unbiased. We're classed, we're gendered beings. We receive the most direct benefit from the research, which problematizes our desire to study particular subject groups and our choices in how we're going to portray those stories and how we might say certain things that will essentialize certain groups. And so, although I'm not Indigenous young people trusted me with their life stories. And so I'm very conscious of this, and I'm sincere in my efforts. And it's important for me to make clear, though, that, the stories that I'm sharing with you, they're told and mediated through me, but I'm trying my best to do justice to these stories as I'll tell you them. And as you might notice with everything that I'm saying, researchers like me, we have various internal conflicts, ones that I'm still reflecting on, even though so much time has passed since I've done this research. So often when I present about this work in person, I ask people to think about a word that comes to mind when I say homeless youth. And people raise their hands, and we go through all of these different concepts that come up. And what happens is that a lot of stereotypes and misconceptions about what it means to be young and homeless start to surface. And because my undergrad is in sociology, I've taken note of how young people who become homeless are socially constructed in our world by society, the media, and then as a result of the media, we get so brainwashed that it becomes like a public perception. This is really important. The reason being is because the way we perceive young people who are homeless ultimately shapes the resources that we offer them, the supports we give them, and how we treat them. As I started to read and learn more, what kept coming up in the literature and through talking to young people during interviews was that youth who become homeless have been defined as these deviant social problems, these threats, these people who we should fear and feel anxious around, people who are dangerous. And after speaking to so many young people about their lived experience, which is the best way to do research, I learned about how much tension is associated with this common but really false narrative about youth, and specifically homeless youth. And so, we have to continue to shift our thinking and our learning about young people who are homeless. In terms of education, what I found is that young people are often seen in the same light. They're seen as these deviant, lazy, disengaged dropouts. Oh, they don't want to be in school. But the question is, how could anybody prioritize attending school when they don't even have a place to sleep or know where their next meal is coming from? Imagine having to do all of what you do in a day, without any food, water, or shelter. It's next to impossible. There's also misconceptions about York Region. Everyone thinks it's this affluent suburb where homelessness doesn't exist. This is completely wrong. A street count that was done in 2019 showed that homelessness is a huge issue in York Region and that youth are overrepresented in this count. And that count didn't even account for those who are living in shelters, couch surfing, or living with family or friends, or otherwise temporarily housed. Another thing I want to mention is that there's been a lot of studies about Black, Indigenous, and other racialized people who are part of sort of this hidden homeless population in York Region, because it's a taboo topic, there's a lot of stigma, and culturally, what happens is that these groups tend to double up with family and friends, where the communities that they are a part of, they tend to step in to take care of each other. And so they want to ensure that they're housed and they don't have to be homeless. And so the numbers are not always accurate for these groups, although these groups are still overrepresented in this population. In terms of some of the main research findings, the narratives of young people in this study revealed a way more complex picture than I had imagined when I first started the work. What their stories taught me is that you'd never expect who would be homeless, especially because in the suburbs of York Region, homelessness is often hidden and therefore undetectable. So if we look at the current slide, many youth in the study, about 60%, told me that homelessness is the much safer option than remaining at home. In terms of shelter and supports, about 80% of study youth felt there should be more services and resources available in York Region, as there aren't enough supports. And just keep this in mind because I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. In terms of mental health, this was majorly concerning for me. 80% of the youth described feeling down, depressed, or hopeless on several days of the week. And in terms of education and schooling, also extremely concerning. Of the 40 youth I interviewed, 30 were not attending school at the time of the interview. And those who were attending were having a really difficult time staying in school. One of the things I also learned while I was doing research in shelters and through the surveys and interviews is that the homelessness sector, which is comprised of emergency services and the shelter system, they are not structured to support young people to continue with their education. Yes, basic necessities are provided, but the emphasis on equally important aspects of a young person's life are not. And so what this means is that young people who are homeless are in some way stripped of their youth. And not only by the homelessness sector, by the education system and the healthcare system as well. So I learned a lot about what loss of home means when I was talking to young people. And so for young people in my study, loss of home was often sudden. It was unexpected, it was traumatic. Having a home, as we all know, meets one of the most basic needs, and it's a human right, shelter. A home is a place where one can eat, rest, sleep, and recover from illness or injury, which is even more, important right now during the pandemic. Keeping young people in a state of homelessness is a violation of youth's human rights. Without a stable home, it would be difficult for any of us to maintain adequate sleep, nutrition, overall health, safety, and connections to mainstream society. Becoming homelessness was a major life event for these young people. It involves a great deal of loss, the loss of community, friends, belongings, support systems, school access, and youth face physical, mental, and educational impacts like crazy. I think all of this became a little bit more evident for me during the COVID pandemic, when there's all these stay-at-home orders, and those were only possible for some people, but not all people. And the disparities became even more evident. Shelters also during the pandemic had to operate at capacity and at certain capacities, and therefore people didn't have the same accommodations that they did before. In the previous slide, I had told you to pay attention to one of the findings about the shelter system, and how young people said that there aren't enough resources and supports for them in York Region. This is problematic because when young people leave York Region to find services where there are more, such as in downtown Toronto, this forces them to lose connections with friends, family, community, and with their home school. The farther one has to go to seek services, the more disconnected they become. So then young people become more entrenched in homelessness, the further that they move away from these connections. Now, the last point on this slide is something that was mentioned a lot by youth. So a lot of people think, get back on your feet, bootstrap your way out of homelessness. But how do you do that when you have nowhere to go? So imagine having to go to school, which is a lot of young people told me this. They go, imagine having to go to school with the same clothes every single day, without washing your hair. Your peers and teachers start to notice. It's stigmatizing and embarrassing. And then often the public perception is that if homeless young people would just get a job, then they wouldn't be homeless. But young people shared with me all the ways in which they can't even prepare for getting a job. You can't create a resume. You can't shower for a job interview. You can't buy clothes for an interview. There's also landlord discrimination. So, for example, even if you get a job and you have enough money to pay for your first month and your last month of rent, if your previous address is the address of a shelter, there's going to be landlord discrimination because that is not preferred by landlords because it looks like you're unstable. Unfortunately, that's the perception that people have in society. These are just some of the multiple ways in which young people were socially excluded and some of the barriers that they faced on a daily basis with regards to trying to find pathways out of homelessness. So if we think about this last point that I made about education and getting a job and that kind of thing, it's not surprising then that 75% of the young people I interviewed were not in school. Not because they didn't want to be, but because no one can go to school without food to eat and a consistent shelter to provide them with safety and security. If we look on the left-hand side, the blue bar shows all the people who are not in school. But if you look on the right-hand side, the green bar shows all of the people who strongly desired to go back to school. It's a lot. And I raised this because there was this interplay in my research regarding young people experiencing mental health issues as a result of the dire experience of homelessness. But those health and mental health issues became even worse because young people were forced to drop out. They were forced to lose connections with family and friends and community, and they were unable to pursue their dreams and desires. What I'm trying to say is that being young and homeless affects a person on every single level and in every context of life. And therefore, holistic interventions are needed, and they were not provided in York Region. As per the previous slide, you saw that 80% of people said, that we don't have enough resources for us to, continue moving forward. This is unfortunate, but it's not surprising, as education has been used as a tool of oppression, discrimination, racism, and marginalization for years. So it was very alarming and sad, but it wasn't surprising when young people told me that it's often what the education system does or doesn't do that has actually led them to becoming homeless. Because the education system doesn't have proper strategies and systems in place to deal with this issue. And so the experience of young people provide us with this key point from my research, that if 30 out of the 40 young people that I interviewed were in the time not at school, this signals this really inherent contradiction in the education system. The education system is always saying, oh, we value success and overall well-being for every single youth. But my study shows that this doesn't involve homeless youth, and this doesn't involve Indigenous youth who are homeless. So the education system also has this really particular relationship with the notion of family and home. And anything outside of that normative notion is often regarded as somebody else's problem. So if there's any signs of family dysfunction or neglect, either the child welfare system is called, or the homelessness sector is where young people are told to go, or young people are expelled onto the streets. All of this is really unfortunate because, as we see on the right-hand side, so many young people desire to go back to school. Now, for all these reasons, I believe that people should stop working in silos. And I think that all the different sectors who are working on this issue need to come together to play a more essential role. This is a quote from a young Indigenous participant from my study. We were talking about how he became homeless, the difficulties with staying in school when a young person is homeless, and how he manages. And so he says, I ended up being on the street. I can't be on the street and go to school at the same time. During my visits to shelters, I was exposed to a lot of complex health challenges of youth, and this is where I'm going to get more into the health and mental health piece. So you'll see on the current slide some of the major themes that came up in our conversations, which I'll outline in more detail over the next few slides. Most youth in the study reported significant negative determinants of poor health related to social exclusion, discrimination, violence, and trauma. There was a lot of pre-street adversity as well, such as poverty, neglect, abuse, bullying, and marginalization. Now, because of frequent public perceptions, it's really difficult when people think of young people who are homeless, and this is what young people told me, that we're seen as mentally ill and drug addicted and dangerous. And so we need to have a larger conversation about this, because it's more difficult to address the challenges of health and mental health when we have these public perceptions about young people who are homeless. The interviews revealed to me that youth are subject to nutritional vulnerability, as well as mental health issues such as anxiety, trauma, depression, and really complicated conditions like learning disabilities, ADHD, ADD, developmental delays. There was one youth that I interviewed who had cerebral palsy, psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, borderline personality disorders, or even multiple concurrent disorders. And there's many consequences for this. For instance, how do homeless youth keep up with school, or how do you continue schooling in any form alongside so many health-related issues? How do you go to school when you don't feel good physically or mentally? So we'll start with the topic of nutritional vulnerability, which in Canada I find to be alarming. Problems of food access and food insecurity are widespread, and homeless youth are greatly impacted. So in a wealthy first world country like Canada, it should be unconscionable that people are nutritionally deprived, especially when we all know, and maybe we're even guilty of it, that food is consumed and wasted in excess. So for people who are housed and financially secure, eating wholesome, nutritious meals daily is challenging. So imagine for these young people, the added challenge for someone who's young, homeless, without adult support, and unable to make ends meet. The other part of this is that poor nutrition during adolescence can negatively impact health over the lifespan, can increase risk for infections. It can also worsen conditions such as depression and substance use. Now, Such factors can also hinder employment and education opportunities and pathways out of homelessness. When I asked Anisha, and by the way, the names that I'm using are pseudonyms, so it's not actually the real names, just to maintain confidentiality of the youth. But when I asked Anisha, a 22-year-old Indigenous youth, about her education and schooling, she told me that she told her college instructor, like, I don't have energy for this. I'm so starving. So I'm pulling myself out of the program. I'm dropping out. So that she had to figure out her life. How does one maintain concentration and energy without a sufficient meal or remain emotionally stable when shelter and food are inaccessible? Many youth also discussed their nutritional vulnerability in relation to having to stay at a shelter and kind of having to eat whatever's provided. So it was a really common understanding amongst a lot of the young people I spoke to that the food provided at shelters wasn't the tastiest or the healthiest, but they were fortunate to have access to a meal rather than suffer with food deprivation. When young people are homeless, I also noted while talking to them that, there's this beggars can't be choosers mentality from those of us who are housed, as in we have the right to tell them that they should be happy for the meal that they're getting at a shelter. Usually what I saw in shelters was that there was donated foods, there was frozen foods, canned foods, and sometimes there would also be expired food. I learned from young Indigenous people and through my colleagues who are Indigenous that for Indigenous people, food is medicine. Food is a connection to earth. Food is about spirituality and healing. And often, like most cultures, food is this reconnection to culture, which is done through food. And so when you're young and homeless, there's no opportunity for this to happen, resulting in these very complex layers of nutritional vulnerability. Research also demonstrates that the longer a young person remains homeless, the more their physical and mental health deteriorates. As a result, youth are more prone to experience exploitation, trauma, and addictions, drop out of school, and become entrenched in street life. The quote on the current slide is from Daniel's interview. Daniel, he'd been in an accident years prior to our interview, and he was having to learn basic motor skills all over again. He had a brain injury. And so he had a lot of memory loss and impairment. And there was a lot of rehabilitation and learning how to walk again, learning how to talk again. And so it was required, I just thought that this was really interesting, this piece. It was required that he would take this daily medication to maintain his health. But with his story in mind, what happens is, imagine trying to, or the difficulty in taking medication to maintain health amidst this instability and precarity of homelessness. So amongst other issues, it's difficult to have medications sent or picked up, resulting in dose instabilities for him, which could put his life at risk. So when you become homeless, what happens is that you move around a lot. And so in order to stay healthy, your services and your resources and supports have to move with you, but this doesn't really happen. And so he was having a really hard time taking the bus to go get his medications and having to pay additional funds for that. And so when I asked him about schooling, alongside his current physical and mental health concerns, he said to me, school doesn't even enter the forefront of my mind. My health is what has to take priority. And his health had definitely deteriorated as a result of homelessness. Youth who are homeless also experience a high degree of emotional distress. The interviews that I took part in made apparent that for the majority of youth in the study, there was various social, situational, and contextual factors that had negatively impacted their mental health. And they had faced severe forms of adversity. Now, regarding depression and anxiety, there were a lot of comments, but I chose to focus on sleep because every time I would be at shelters, I noticed that a lot of young people would be sleeping a lot. They'd be sleeping on couches, in hallways, completely under the covers, or just very tired in our interactions. Some even mentioned homelessness being so stressful that it's like a full-time job. This is why we see on the current slide that 70% spoke about having trouble falling asleep, not being able to sleep for consecutive days, sleeping too much, and not having consistent or restful sleep due to the anxiety and stresses of homelessness, and feeling depressed, even if they had a warm bed or a place to stay, even if they were staying in a shelter. The other thing was that, admitting that you are dealing with mental health issues, unfortunately, even in 2022, those admissions carried with them stigma and feelings of exclusion. And so it was difficult for a lot of young people to talk about this. In terms of substance use and addictions, Not every youth suffered from these issues, but due to the dire situation of homelessness, young people were at higher risks and more vulnerable. For example, some youth told me that substance use was the only way for them to stay warm after being outside in the freezing cold, or to sleep, or to kill hunger pains. And so I had this really emotion-filled interview with a young man named James, again, a pseudonym. And he told me that he and his friends would just find these abandoned homes and they would just stay there and they would get high like for days on end, just to cope with the adversities of being homeless. And if we see, from his quote, James felt that nobody cared, as if friends, family, and society had forgotten about him because they didn't want to accept that this way of life, homelessness, exists for some people. Now, in contrast, we can do a deeper analysis of what he's saying, and we can say, there's this importance of like peer group support amongst young people who are homeless, which I saw a lot of. James and his friends, they seem to see their way of homelessness as anarchistic, revolutionary, and as counterculture, which for them was all protective factors. Feelings related to being misunderstood, loneliness, alienation, isolation, despair, alongside loss of family and community, further compounded the health issues that youth faced. So for these reasons, homeless and street-involved youth experience high rates of suicidal ideation, and suicide rates are elevated compared to the general population. So if we look at the stat on this current slide, approximately 25% of the youth in this study expressed having suicidal ideations on several days of the week. Many also shared with me, which was very difficult to hear, self-harm events that were either provoked by hopelessness or intended as a cry for help. So if we see this quote from Timothy, he says, I knew I didn't want to die, but I knew that I wanted someone to notice that I was going through a hard time. And a lot of young people talked about how they had wished that, a teacher or a guidance counselor or a coach had just asked them how they were doing and if things were okay, and that they really did feel that sometimes teachers and schools knew that something was wrong, but they would never go out of their way to ask. And that would have made the world of a difference. All of these issues can translate into greater and long-lasting mental health challenges and harms, especially because places like shelters are poorly equipped to meet these mental health concerns. And so, one of the questions that I'm still left with is, how can we help young people who are homeless find positive solutions towards better mental health so that they can move forward in meaningful ways? As I'm approaching the end of my talk, there's some aspects of this research that I want you to continue to think about and take away with you. And so these are some of the things that, I always think about. Homelessness is always a public health issue. Homelessness is always a health and mental health issue. Indigenous youth homelessness is shaped by a complex, unjust, racist, and oppressive history of colonization. Having a home is a human right. Homelessness, in a first world country such as Canada, should be unacceptable. In terms of York Region, homelessness does exist in the suburbs of York Region. And Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous knowledges are really needed in homelessness and mental health interventions. Now, because this topic is so bleak, I do want to talk about some progressive efforts that are being taken, and I can share two of those with you. So one of the programs at one of the shelters is called iGrad. It's an educational partnership between York Region District School Board and this particular shelter called 360 Kids, where young people can enroll and do their high school credits whenever they want. So if you want to finish a biology course that you have left over in a month or in a year, you can do that. So they had that, I saw that, I thought that was really good. And then we also have Undian, which is an Indigenous adaptation of Housing First for Youth. This is a partnership between Waakabanis Institute for Indigenous Health, Making the Shift, as Dr. Suzanne Stewart was talking about earlier, and Hamilton Regional Indian Center. This program is, it aims to contribute to understandings of Indigenous youth experiencing or at risk of homelessness in Canada. And it's sort of an adaptation of Housing First for Youth with the adult model, but it's grounded in the belief that all young people have a right to housing, and that those who have experienced homelessness will do better and recover more effectively if they are first provided with housing with no conditions. Now, in hopes to end on a positive note, I want to speak a bit about future research steps I'll be taking alongside the support of wonderful colleagues like Dr. Suzanne Stewart, like Dr. Michaela Gabriel. I'd like to raise more awareness about this research, address stereotypes and myths about the topic of homelessness, and really bring to the forefront what a serious issue this is. I also want to use my privilege to pursue additional research during my postdoc to explore Indigenous homelessness and mental health, and to figure out what's happening in the field on a more systemic level and what kinds of supports and interventions are in place. I aim to complete this work through an anti-racist and decolonizing lens, and to really understand what that means and what that looks like, so that we can get people off the streets, provide the supports that they need in order for them to live meaningful lives and move forward. And thank you so much for listening to my presentation and engaging with the research. I welcome any questions or comments that you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mirza. That was really insightful and amazing. And I'm really, I don't know, I knew about your work, but I didn't actually know it to this level. And seeing your presentation really opened my eyes to helping understand you as a researcher. And I think I have a question, and if other people have questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A. The question I have is, this is just such, it's a comment and a question, this is such an abundant amount of important information. And, you know, given that I'm so familiar with the Indigenous homelessness data and literature, I would say this has a huge novel contribution by saying that Indigenous homelessness and homelessness in general for BIPOC young people is a big issue in affluent suburbs, because I think that's something that's not well articulated in the literature, or that isn't well known, and it certainly isn't well addressed. And I'm wondering if you have any plans for how to maybe share some of this knowledge from your research with the youth themselves, and what are some kind of creative ways that these results could be used to make concrete changes for the youth that were involved in your project, or who other youth who exist in the same area.
Thanks, Suzanne, for that question. This is something I really wanted to do while I was conducting the research. The research was done in 2017. And so it was quite a long time ago. But the thing is that every time I went to shelters, it wouldn't always be the same people who were there. And so as much as I wanted to bring back the results and do member checking and ask them, you know, if my analysis of it was correct, I think because of the precariousness of homelessness, it was really difficult to reconnect. And so in the future, I would hope to find some ways that I can do that, maybe with your help. I wasn't able to do that with this work at all. And sorry, I just see your message that said you have 5 minutes left.
Oh, yeah, that's okay. I was trying to get your attention, but you were winding down.
Okay.
So were there? So there's another question in the chat. Were there any challenges to connecting and engaging youth to share their experiences?
Yes. Thank you, Michaela, for that question. There were a lot of challenges because a lot of people had turned their backs on these young people. And so the level of trust had to really be established over weeks and weeks. There were some people who said, you know, I've been watching you for, 2 months, and now I'm finally ready to engage in an interview. And there was this one guy who kept saying, I feel like you're a narc. So, I feel like you're just like, I just can't, I don't know why you're here, and I just can't take part in the interview, and I'm sorry. And, that's okay. You just kind of have to be in the field and engage with people as they want to. But there was definitely trust issues. There was definitely issues with people saying like, see you tomorrow. And then I'd be going somewhere else the next day, and just feeling bad because so many people who were close with them, they were disconnected from. And so those were some of the challenges I faced with regards to Michaela's question.
Great. Well, thank you. We only have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to thank everyone for being here today, all of the attendees who made time to come here and listen to this, and to let you all know that this presentation is archived on the Waakabeness Bryce YouTube channel, as well as on the Ontario NEIHR website. So if you follow WBIIH on YouTube, subscribe to our channel. This and all of our other webinars are archived on there. And also, I think Dr. Mirza has some publications out or is working on some related to
He's
this.
working on some.
Yeah, so you can look for those too. And we post all of our publications on our website as well. And that's a work in progress. So I will turn over to Clay with any closing comments and the closing prayer, which I'm really grateful to hear from him. And thank you again, Dr. Mirza, Roy for organizing, and everyone else for being here, and to Clay for keeping us grounded in spirit. So miigwech.
Thank you. Oh, Clay's audio.
Clay, you're muted.
I'm talking and then I realize I'm on mute here. So again, I say miigwech. Dr. Mirza, what an amazing talk. It was just, I had no idea. And it was just kind of like, I just echo what Suzanne was saying. It's just incredible, and learned a lot. And yeah, it's just so, and again, thank you for your hard work. So miigwech for all the things you do.
Thank you so much, Clay.
So with that, I just want to say where time is ticking here. So they're going to just say quick. And I just, again, we've asked Spirit to be with us in a good way, in a kind way, wherever you are. We just have to let them go wherever they need to go and do their work. So with that, I say miigwech to the earth, the sun, the sky, and creation. And I give thanks to our ancestors, your ancestors, for being with you in a good way, in a kind way. And again, humbly ask our Creator for blessings for all of us in a good way, in a kind way, to keep us safe. And why we're here to work for the people. And may we always have in our hearts and our minds the youth who are on the streets, right? And thank you for reminding me of this. There's so much going on in our lives and we forget about so many things, but thank you again. And I ask for the blessings for the youth again who are there. And may we find the answers to make this right. I say miigwech to you, Creator, for this day, all my relations. Miigwech.
Miigwech.